Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. On this week's episode of the show, I talk to Zen Faulkes, who is the author of the new book, Better Posters. As you might suspect, I really like the name Better Posters, the title Better Posters. In it, Zen talks about all the things that are important to consider and do when you are creating a poster for an academic conference. I also think it happens to work for when you are thinking about creating an infographic or presentation slides or data visualization. Even though it's specific to this one part of data communication, I think there's a lot going on here that a lot of us can learn about data communication. So we talk about Zen's background coming into this poster area. He talked about his areas, his interest in design, working with data, academics, what it's like to actually be in a conference poster session. If you've never been to one, it's quite an interesting experience, and Zen will talk a lot about that in the interview today, about what it means to actually sit in this huge room of so many different people talking about their content. And then we spend a bunch of time talking about what are good ways to lay posters out? What does it mean to actually stand there? What does he think about conference poster contests? Something that I struggle with when it comes to data visualization contests. So we spend a bunch of time talking about all of those different aspects of his new book, Better Posters. I hope you'll enjoy the episode. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. And I hope you'll check out his book and all of these things I've, of course, linked to on the show notes page. So here is my interview with Zen Faulkes. Hey Zen, good to see you. Welcome to the PolicyViz podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I feel like right off the bat that I should put in a disclaimer that this interview, despite the name of the podcast, will probably have no policy and very little viz. So I just want to apologize to any listeners right now.
Well, I don't know. I mean, so here's the book that we're talking about. So Better Posters, which of course is a name that the title of the book I really appreciate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on visualization in this book, and we'll talk about more of this. But what I love about it is there's a lot of aspects to visualization, to data visualization, that maybe not a lot of people think about, that you in the poster world have to think about a lot, like the actual layout of something. Whereas
Right.
like if I make a graph and it's an image file, I sort of post it and I'm done. But you're creating multiple things.
Yes, so that is one of the challenges of a poster, is that it's all in one. It has to be a complete little ship in the bottle, to use
Right.
an analogy,
Yeah.
which is one of the things that makes it a very challenging format.
Right. So I want to go back to the beginning, really, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, and maybe if you can remember like the first poster that you created, and was it like how many people, like their first graph or their first presentation was terrible and they realized that there's a better way. So like
Sure.
so where do you like come from to get to this point about talking about helping people and make better posters?
So the book arose from a blog of the same name, which I started about 12 years ago, because I was seeing that there were other really good blogs out there about oral presentations. And there's tons of books about oral presentations. And I sort of realized that there was this unfilled niche for discussions about conference posters, which are very much unique to academic, and even more specifically, the scientific academic world. You can go see an oral presentation at business conferences with keynotes, but you don't go into a business convention and see rows of poster presentations.
Right.
That's very much like an academic thing.
Yeah.
And I realized nobody else was talking about this on sort of an ongoing basis. There were a few websites that talked about it just as, here's my advice as a blog post or something like that, but I thought there was much more to dig into. So that was the start of that. Now, to go back even further of what gave me confidence slash hubris to think that I would have anything reasonable to say is sort of twofold. So I had worked at the student newspaper as an undergraduate, doing layout and so forth, pretty much for most of my undergraduate career. And so I had a bit of experience with doing layout and some of the basics of graphic design.
Hmm.
And if you want to go way back to not my first poster, but even before that, I was one of those science fair kids, back in grade
Mm.
school, like, grades like junior high,
Yeah.
maybe even elementary school. I can't even remember where I did them. Um, what years? I know I didn't do any in high school. It was before that. But I did reasonably well, I think, I made it to the provincials science fair a couple of times. I think the best I ever did was second at a provincial for my age category. But in terms of doing those science fair projects, there's some similarities between
Yeah.
those and,
Yeah.
and posters. And I remember one of my teachers saying, "You have a really strong eye for the graphic end of things." And
Mm.
so I that was part of the fun of doing the science fair posters for me, was like messing around with Electroset and doing some of these things to kind of make it look nice.
Yeah.
So I've been messing around with these sort of things on and off for a long time. And then really with the blog was when I got serious about it and doing it on a regular basis. And I decided to teach myself some more because people started to find the blog and recommend the blog. And it was like, oh, now I have a responsibility. It's like, oh, other people are actually reading this. And
Reading this, right?
they
Yeah.
would tell me, it's like, I recommend it to my students, to my graduate students, and so forth. And so um, there was that sense of, there's a readership, and people started
Hmm.
sending me things for review, uh, which was really the best part of the whole project,
Yeah.
was that input from other people, which was the thing that made it the thing I'm now best known for. Uh,
Right.
I,
Right.
I joke all the time. It's like, yeah, I have 60 peer-reviewed scientific papers, but I go to a conference, and it's like, you're the poster guy, aren't you?
Poster guy. Yeah.
So yes,
Yeah.
embrace it.
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah.
I have
Right.
written.
Yeah.
I've written the book now, so
Right.
I've just embraced my destiny, and I will no longer
Right.
fight it. I'm no longer. I am no longer a crayfish biologist. I'm the poster guy.
You're a poster guy. Yeah. So I want to talk about the section, a bunch of the sections of the book, but I want to. You were talking about the importance of layout. So if you had to like say there's one thing, and I know there's not, but if you were forced to say there's one thing, like the most important thing, is it layout or is it the brevity of the text? Like, what is like the if you had to like narrow it down to one thing for a poster, which is again different from all these other
Yeah.
mediums, what would that one thing be?
The one thing is coming up with the one thing that the poster is
The one
going to
thing.
be about. It's
Yeah.
about the editorial decisions, because what I see as the most common problem with many posters is lack of message discipline. So people are trying to do too many things on the poster. They are trying to show all the data, and they are unwilling, and in some cases unable, but it's usually just that they are very reluctant not to show everything that they got.
Yeah.
And so I'm always saying, look, this isn't your journal article. This is conference poster.
Yeah.
You don't have infinite space, and you really have to make a decision about what is the most important thing that I want to show.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very challenging thing that for everybody. It's always tough to edit your own work, which is what most people are having to do. And
Right.
uh, it's challenging because quite often the thing that people want want is that they say, sort of in the abstract as a viewer, that they want all the detail and all the fiddly bits. But the reality is, and when they're there on the ground, they get tired and they have like all these posters, and it's like, that's not the reality. The reality is you really want a summary,
Right. Right.
for most of these things. You really want to be able to talk to somebody and get something worthwhile in 5 minutes. That's what
Yeah.
most people have indicated to me. That's the kind of time they want to spend talking to somebody at a conference. And that's very challenging. Very, very challenging to get down to 5 minutes. It's the equivalent of an Ignite talk, which is a format that some people might know from slide presentations, which is a 5-minute PowerPoint presentation. And you really have to think about it in terms of that level of concision.
So can you, maybe we should have backed up first, but can you paint a picture for us, for those of the listeners who are not academics, maybe never been to a poster session? Can you paint that picture for us? And just from some of the pictures in the book, there are some pictures of actual like poster sessions, and some drawings of ones, and the ones that I go to may not be as big as some of the ones that you describe, but they're large enough. But yeah, maybe paint that picture for listeners who may have not had this. I'll just say experience. I won't put any judgment on top of it, but it's an experience. We'll just put it that way.
It absolutely is, especially when you go to some of the larger ones. So the largest one that I have been to is fairly well known in the scientific community. It is the Society for Neuroscience. And it only goes to a few cities in the US because there's only a few cities that are large enough to hold it. The last few years before the pandemic, it was usually drawing about 30,000 people. I've lived in towns that are not 30,000 people. Now, admittedly, I'm a small town Prairie boy, but that's an enormous number of people. So something that some people may know or have heard about is the San Diego Comic-Con, which is this huge media event, and they may have seen pictures of that, the size of that venue. The Society for Neuroscience is often held in that venue because it needs something that big to accommodate all of these people. So you think about, okay, you've got 30,000 geeky neuroscientists, and they're presenting their work, and they're in the floor of this enormous convention center that you walk into, and it looks like they could be building a Boeing 747 in the back. It goes on and on and on. And so there's lots of things in the main hall, but the major thing that you see is row after row after row after row after row after row for hundreds of meters of poster boards. And so they are, over the course of usually about 5 days, there are tens of thousands of poster presentations that switch twice a day. So you have usually, so that is, for many people, the first time they go to it, it is an overwhelming experience, either for scientists who have been to other, maybe even fairly large meetings, which might be 1,000 people, something like that. They go to neuroscience, or another big one is the American Geophysical Union, which is, I think, comparable. I think it's maybe a little smaller. And they're kind of blown away by the amount of stuff there is to see, and the amount of science and the amount of content to navigate. So it's very tough for, as I said before, the poster is a challenging format. The conference is challenging as an audience member. How do you, forget about making a splash professionally. How do you even make a ripple in that kind of situation where you're up against thousands of other presentations at the same time going on all around you? It's challenging. Now, I happen to love that because it's exciting and you see all of this stuff and there's so much science. There's something that you're going to learn, like just guaranteed, if you have any curiosity. But it can be very tiring.
Yeah. Because as you walk through, and I'm going to guess it's the same as you walk through, um, there are people, the author or
Yeah,
authors, I guess, are standing in front of their posters. And so, I mean, it must be, I mean, I'm imagining, so the main economics conference often takes place in San Diego, but it doesn't go to the convention center. It's a combination of the convention center and some of the
right.
hotels, but not like that huge room. And I imagine it's like being in a football stadium with the amount of noise and trying to have these
There's
discussions.
very rarely a wave that goes on, you know.
Yeah, right.
Um, or there's very rarely that moment of, oh, the crowd goes
Yeah,
wild.
right,
So it's not quite as
right.
bad as the stadium, but there's definitely, for a lot of people, it's a lot of sensory input. There's a
Yeah.
lot going on, um, and one of the things that I recommend to people is, go in with a plan. You have to,
Hmm.
because I have talked to people who said the first time they went to one of these massive meetings, that their plan was, okay, I'm going to start with row A, poster one, and I'm just going to go. And it's like, no. You cannot do that.
Never gonna
You
work. Yeah,
cannot do
yeah,
that. Fortunately, usually there's like at least titles which are given out to people in advance. And so you usually can figure out, okay, these are the posters that I want to see. They're organized by session, by themes, by session, by topic. So it's not as though it's just like 10,000 people and it's like walking into an anthill and you're trying to find an ant. No, it's like,
hmm
it's a little bit like that, but there is some organization to it.
some
It's like,
organization.
if
Right,
you're interested
right.
in Alzheimer's disease, you go to this set of rows. If you're interested in locomotion, you go to this set of rows. If you're in, there
Hmm.
again, good
Right.
organization by the conference organizers is really critical to having that good poster session experience. But there's only so
Yeah,
much you can do when you have so many people giving
yeah.
posters at the
So
same
many
time.
posters. Yeah, right. I mean, it's one of the things I actually love about the book is that you cover the entire process, not just for the person creating the poster, because you have a whole chapter on like how to print the damn thing, but you also have a section at the end about like how do conference organizers set it up and what should they provide to people and how should they define the rules for a contest, which I want to come back to in a moment. But I did want to ask you because you have a section in the book about infographics, and I wanted to get your take on how a conference poster is different from an infographic, because I feel like a lot of infographic designers might be really good at creating conference posters
Absolutely.
if they had that
Now,
experience.
I do have a, I don't want to say it's a rant in the book, but that I do find the term infographic to be spectacularly unhelpful in many ways.
I agree.
Um,
I agree.
because
Yeah.
it's like, what does that even
What is it?
mean? It's a
Yeah.
graphic with information. How is it different from a graph? How is it different from this? Um, but be that as it may, I think the big difference between a conference poster and what most people think of when they hear the word infographic is that a conference poster usually is by an academic, so it's very influenced by academic style and academic
Mm.
journal articles. So an infographic is usually very much a standalone sort of thing, but it can have kind of any structure that you want. The vast majority of conference posters that you see have a very defined, familiar structure. For anybody who's read academic articles, you know that there's like a way that they are structured. And it's usually there's a title, there's an introduction, there's a method section, there's a results section, and there's a discussion section. And it's very rare that you get deviation from that. Some journals move the method section to the end, but that format is something that so many academics are so familiar with, and they're so ingrained in using that format. They read it, and it's a good format in many ways. Is that it just ends up coming up on the conference poster as well. They use that same structure. And in an infographic by somebody who is not from that culture,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to see it laid out in that way. So I think that's one of the
Right.
major differences. Now, that said, I think that a lot of academics could learn from that. No, you do not have to follow that format of the journal article. It's not a paper.
Right.
And I think that they get very locked into that format when there's no need to. It's like, you can do what you want. You are free. Let anarchy reign.
Right.
But quite often they're reluctant to do that. And so they tend to be a little conservative on the design and the editorial side.
Yeah. I mean, you do lay out in the book multiple um, structures or layouts that people can use in the posters, and sort of you have, I would say, a light recommendation. Maybe is that fair to say? Like I think you say that there are a couple that you like, but like have at it,
Sure.
whatever
I
works
think
for
there
you.
are some kinds of posters. There's some kinds of formats that just work. It's really hard to
Mm-hmm.
screw it up. So it's a little bit like a movie or a television show, right? There's a reason why there are this whole range of sports movies where there's an underdog team that comes up against the champion, right? That story just
Right.
works, and people never get tired of seeing that kind of story. Or the cop buddy movie where the two partners go together and they are completely different and they start off hating each other, but they have to work together to solve a crime. It's like, how many times have you seen that movie or television episode, right? Because
Right.
if you just pay attention to a few things, it's really kind of hard to mess it up. You have something
Yeah.
which is usually okay, at least. And that's the same thing with conference posters. There's certain formats where it's like, if you put it up, nobody's going to complain. It will just kind of be at least okay. And heaven knows, I've seen enough posters that were not even okay to know that for many people, that level of reaching some kind of bare level of minimal competency of rather than my eyes, is a big win.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think you make the point very clearly. Like, the bar is set pretty low
It's
to have like a
abysmally low.
really good poster.
I hate to say it. And I say this as one of, these are my people, and I say this as one of them, but it's like, oh my God, we're horrible sometimes. And I've made some of those posters. I mean, one of my least successful posters is in the frontispiece of the book, where it's like, I look at it now and I sort of critique it later in the book.
Cringe, yeah.
And the reason I put it as the frontispiece was not because I was happy with the poster, but because at the time, I was having a good day, and I liked the picture because I was feeling very relaxed and very in my element, which is how I've always kind of felt about poster sessions. And I wanted to convey that feeling of being in the poster session. On the one hand, it's kind of casual because it's like not a very structured kind of thing, but it's also very exciting because there's so many people who are bringing you the absolute latest stuff from their labs, and there's so much that you can learn.
Yeah.
And so that's why I picked what has a picture of a very bad poster in the front of the book.
Well, I think you make a really good point early on in the book that posters are not somehow lower or worse than or not as sophisticated as giving the 5-minute or 10-minute presentation talk. And I'm sure it varies from field to field, but I think that is a really important point, especially for more junior people who can still get out there and share their work.
I am one of the realizations that I had in writing the book is that objectively, I think that a poster is the hardest format. Because with slides, you have as many slides as you want. with a journal article, you have as many words as you want, typically, depending on language. But a poster, you have like what's within the poster board. So you have a very limited space, you have a very limited time, you are competing for attention, very often with many, many hundreds, if not thousands of other posters, in a busy, crowded environment. And what do? We give that to people who are just starting out, most often. We give them the
Right.
hardest task in information
Yeah.
display to people with the least experience, because it's people think, oh, it's less stressful. And yes, I get that fear of presentation, like an oral presentation, is very high, and I get that that is very stressful for a lot of people. But the actual design, the actual,
Design. Yeah.
what am I going to say and how am I going to present that in a way that is um, helpful to somebody, is really, really hard. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
this is one of the reasons why I want people to take posters more seriously and to acknowledge
Mm-hmm.
that we're giving this very, very hard task to often very inexperienced people.
Yeah.
And so that they deserve more respect.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's absolutely right, and I can only speak from my field, but it's certainly the case that there is a lot of sort of looking down on the poster folks. Even though you are having this more intimate discussion with people who are walking by, that I would guess you probably get better feedback and you probably have more better discussions than you do in these in
Mhm.
the verbal presentation, where you get your 10 minutes, you talk, three other people go, and then that's, you maybe have some Q&A and that's it, and people sort of disperse to the next session. Whereas you have this, actual, you can
Yes.
have these like
And
in-depth
that I
conversations
think
with
that
people.
is the
Yeah.
real strength of the format. And the thing is, and I understand why people want to have the oral presentation, because you see the keynotes, right? You can have the
Yeah.
keynote
Yeah.
with 1,000 people, and you can
Right.
reach more people than you can with a poster. Because you're
Yeah.
not going to get a 20-foot by 30-foot poster board. You can't scale
Yeah.
up. You can't get a billboard in the
Yeah.
conference center. Whereas you can effectively do that with an oral presentation. You can have a small room, you can have a medium-sized room, you can have the keynote room. And so people sort of see that and they see, oh, the keynote, he's in the big room. I want to be in the big room. You know, I don't want to be in the
Big room.
little
Yeah.
room because I'm not going to reach as many people. So
Yeah.
in terms of that numbers game, yes, an oral presentation can be a much more effective way of displaying your message. But in terms of starting a conversation, like a real conversation, not a monologue, but somebody being able to say, have you thought about this, and really give you, and really sort of, wait, can you stop? I don't understand this. That, I think, is what posters do better than any other format, bar
Mm-hmm.
none. Okay, except maybe the talk in the bar,
Yeah.
and the pub afterwards. But
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that is the real
But all,
strength of that format. Is that when you're talking to somebody in front of their poster, they're not checking their email like they'll do in an oral presentation.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also the case that I think a lot of us forget that the point or the purpose of an academic conference is to share information and to
Yes.
get feedback and then to improve the science. Whereas I think a lot of people approach conferences as sort of a way to
Yes.
show off the work, but not to get the feedback part, which is, often what we want to do in these,
And
in
showing
these
off the work
times.
is, I get it. I'm a show off. I love that. Everybody to some degree wants to have, it's fun being on the big stage. It's fun being the center of attention. And there's a place for that, 100%, to broadcast those kinds of fairly complete stories. But I think that there's also that importance for the real one-to-one conversations that you can just have the back and
Yeah.
forth that you're not going to get in very many other situations.
Right. Yeah. I totally agree. I wanted to ask one last question, because as I mentioned earlier, you do spend some time at the back end of the book talking about
Mhm.
conference organizers. You talk about which I like. The whole thing is just so ingenious, I think, to add these like practical pieces, like what do you wear, and like conference organizers, like how do you set it up, and what do you do about people who are being inappropriate in various ways. Yeah. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned it, I think, kind of in passing, about these conference
Yes.
poster contests that happen at a lot of conferences, and I'm curious what your take on that is, because I sort of feel it is very similar to having a data
Mhm.
visualization conference, because you know they're evaluating sort of the design, but not necessarily the science, and they're not reviewing the data, right? Like, I
Mhm.
feel like I could make a really nice poster if I didn't have to worry about outliers and all these weird data
If you
points. I
weren't
could, right?
constrained
Like,
by the data,
so
damn it.
if I want right, if I wasn't constrained by the data and I was just concerned about winning a poster contest, so I'm just curious how you feel about that, and given your description of the huge
Yeah.
room earlier with hundreds of posters, like, so what's your
Well, I will
feeling on
typically
those,
say
about
that
those sort of
the
concepts?
really big conferences, as far as I know, I don't know if there's any of those really huge ones that have poster competitions. Those are usually something that are going on at
Okay.
the smaller venues, in the smaller
Okay.
um, meetings. Now, that said, I think that
Yeah.
there's you bring up some really good points, um, and I thought about them this quite a bit. Now, I think the first thing is, well, is design subjective? And I think that to some degree, yes, but also no. I think that there's definitely
Right.
some things where you can say, well, this is a better design than another design, right? Um, just as in, there's certain best practices. In To use an example, if you have a graph, are the axes labeled? Do they have units? Those kinds of things, I don't think are subjective. They're best practices of the
Right.
craft. So I think that
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
some things which there's a subjective element to it, but on the other hand, there really is an objective kind of design that people can look at and say, "Oh, there's a problem. This is a problem. This is not."
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Now, in terms of the fact that, well, are these things vetted or not? How do we know that the data have not been altered in some way? Um, some conferences actually do review the presentation before they go in, so they're actually peer reviewed at the outset. That's
Okay.
unusual, though, and I'll say that. But even
Yeah.
then, I don't think they do sort of an audit of all the data. I mean, even most academic
No.
journals
Right.
don't
It's
do
like
that,
a
right?
peer review.
So
Right.
I
No, that's
think
right.
that
Right.
that is, there's this understanding that these are works in progress most frequently. They're usually not completed works. Again, these are typically
Hmm.
students, and quite often they are the competitions are by experience of students. So you have undergraduate versus graduate student awards. They're usually not given to senior faculty at all. Um,
Right.
and so I think that with that understanding that yes, there's limitations, and yes, there's going to be an element of luck of the draw in terms of whether you uh, win the competition or not, because there is that subjective element. I'm not going to say that there isn't. Um, but on the other
Hmm.
hand, I think that those sorts of things are, first of all, for many people enjoy competition. Why deny them of that, right? Many people,
Yeah.
competition
Yeah. That's
brings
fair.
out the best in them. You know, we just had the Olympic Games, and uh, there are some people who really want to be the winner at the Olympic Games. And then there's the people who just want to run around their block on the weekend. And I think that we can, to some degree, accommodate both of those kinds of people and the goals and the things that they enjoy. And I think that there's also, to some degree, a little bit of an advantage of, when we're talking about these kinds of things, that they are something which are meant to build people's careers. Posters, just in general, are really important because they're frequently the first thing that somebody does professionally. It's very frequently like the very first line in their CV in terms of chronology. And I think that's another reason why we need to take this really seriously for people. And similarly for that opportunity to get not just that you presented a poster, but that you had a winning poster, for many people is such a big builder of their career, because we all know that once you get one award, it makes getting the second one much easier. And I think that the difficulty is, of course, that it's like there's more good work than there is awards.
Yeah. Well, hopefully now there'll be more better posters out there. So there's so that's the book. For folks who haven't seen it, I do recommend you check it out. Zen walks through that, as I mentioned, the entire process. And I think there's, even people who aren't creating posters, I think it's easy to go in here and take stuff out if you are making infographics. If you're not making academic, even if you're not making an academic poster, I think there's a lot in here to help folks who are making, maybe digital or other posters, or just, infographics, as there's a lot of great pieces of advice and strategies in here. So Zen, thanks so much for the book. Thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been great chatting.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this week's episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned a little bit of something. And I hope you will check out Zen's book. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning and mentioned throughout the conversation with Zen, I think there's just a lot to learn here for all of our different types of data communication, whether it's an infographic, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's just a standalone graph, whether it's a PowerPoint or keynote presentation. There's a lot to learn in this book about font, layout, color, structure, thinking about being concise, as he mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation. So I hope you'll check it out. Thanks so much for listening. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast.